In 1933, Americans woke up to find their gold was no longer theirs. The real story isn't just the confiscation itself, it's who complied, who didn't, and what that still means today. On the morning of April 6, 1933, Americans opened their newspapers and learned that their gold was now the government's gold. Not tomorrow. Not after a long court fight. Right now. Executive Order 6102 had been signed the day before, giving citizens exactly 26 days to turn in every gold coin, gold bar, and gold certificate they held at a government-set price of $20.67 per ounce. Refusing meant a $10,000 fine, 10 years in prison, or both. The U.S. government had just made it a federal crime to own the money Americans had carried in their pockets all their lives. Nearly a century later, the question still hangs over every gold owner. Could it happen again? To answer that, you have to understand what happened in 1933, not the official version, but the forensic one. The official story says Americans complied, that patriots in a national emergency went to their banks, surrendered their gold, and took paper dollars in return. The forensic record says something very different. According to Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz, between 75 and 80% of privately held gold was never surrendered. 3 out of 4 ounces were hidden, buried, shipped overseas, reclassified, or simply kept. The real question is how millions of ordinary Americans got through the last confiscation and what that tells us about what actually works. To understand that, you have to understand what the government was trying to do. In April 1933, Franklin Roosevelt had been president for exactly 1 month. The Depression was in its 4th year. 15 million Americans were unemployed. Half the nation's children lacked adequate food or shelter. More than 9,000 banks had already failed. 3 weeks before the order, Roosevelt had shut every bank in the country. No withdrawals, no deposits, nothing. The gold reserves of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York had fallen below the legal minimum required to back paper currency. The system was close to collapse. When the banks reopened on March 13th, depositors surprised everyone. They lined up not to take money out, but to put it back. Roosevelt's first fireside chat had worked, but the deeper problem remained. The United States was losing gold rapidly. Foreign creditors wanted payment in metal, not paper. American citizens were hoarding coins instead of spending them. Every dollar in circulation was legally redeemable in gold on demand, and people were starting to demand it. The gold standard had become a shackle. The government wanted to break it, but it could not devalue the dollar as long as citizens could still exchange paper for gold at the old rate. Gold had to disappear from private hands first. Executive Order 6102 was not mainly about punishing hoarders. It was about taking control of the monetary system. The confiscation was the prerequisite. The real plan came after. 9 months after Americans had been forced to surrender their gold at $20.67 an ounce, Roosevelt signed the Gold Reserve Act in January 1934 and revalued gold to $35 an ounce. Overnight, the book value of the government's gold reserves, much of it collected from citizens, jumped by nearly $3 billion. In effect, citizens who complied got 59 cents on the dollar for their own property. The gold they turned in immediately became 69% more valuable. The Americans who kept their gold quietly preserved far more purchasing power than the ones who obeyed. The enforcement threat was severe on paper. The order promised 10 years in prison and a $10,000 fine, roughly $250,000 in today's money. Newspapers printed warnings. Radio broadcasts cast surrender as patriotism. Bank posters went up everywhere, but the actual enforcement record looks very different. Exactly 1 person was ever directly prosecuted under Executive Order 6102 itself. Frederick Barber Campbell, a 62-year-old Harvard graduate and Wall Street attorney who had 5,000 ounces in gold bars on deposit at Chase National Bank. When he tried to reclaim them in September 1933, Chase refused and turned the matter over to federal authorities. One of the prosecutors on the case was a young assistant U.S. attorney named Thomas Dewey, who would later run for president twice. A judge ruled that the order was technically invalid because it had been signed by the wrong official, but Campbell's gold was seized anyway. He never got it back. A few others were prosecuted under related regulations. A jeweler caught in a Secret Service sting for selling 13 gold coins without a license, a father and son running a gold refining business under a fraudulent permit, and a foreign company that had stored gold with an American firm. The documented prosecutions across the entire United States total only about 20 people. There were no house-to-house sweeps. There were no door-to-door searches. The story that safe deposit boxes were sealed and searched is a documented myth. The government got most of its gold from institutions it already controlled, banks, Federal Reserve member institutions, and companies that carried gold on their books. Those entities could not hide it and had no choice. The ordinary American with gold coins in a drawer or buried in a coffee can in the yard was practically unreachable. The forensic record shows 4 methods that actually worked. The first was the personal exemption. EO 6102 allowed each individual to keep up to $100 in gold coin, about 5 ounces. A family of 5 could legally hold $500 in gold, roughly 24 ounces, simply by spreading the coins across each family member, including the children. Contemporary reports describe grandmothers who stayed just under the limit in their safe deposit boxes for decades and remained fully legal. The second method was the numismatic exemption, and it was so large that entire fortunes could fit through it. EO 6102 exempted gold coins with recognized special value to collectors of rare and unusual coins. Now, it never defined rare or unusual. It never said who would decide. It never published an approved list. Decades later, numismatic attorney David Gans argued that anyone who simply declared himself a collector could probably have kept almost everything he owned legally. Treasury Secretary William Wooden, who oversaw implementation of the order, was himself a serious coin collector. Some historians do not think that was a coincidence. The practical rule that emerged was simple: no more than 5 coins of the same denomination and date in identical condition. Any difference in date, mint mark, or grade helped support a collectible claim. In theory, someone could assemble an almost complete set of $20 double eagles and $10 eagles and hold them legally as a collection. In 1954, the Treasury officially expanded the definition to include all U.S. gold coins minted before April 5th, 1933, effectively legitimizing what millions had already been doing for 20 years. The third method was foreign storage. EO 6102 applied to gold inside the continental United States. Coin dealer Abe Kossoff arranged for wealthy clients to ship their $20 gold pieces to banks in Switzerland, France, the Netherlands, and Belgium before the deadline expired. When private gold ownership was legalized again in 1974, coin dealers opened offices in Brussels, Paris, and Zurich, specifically to source the American gold that was coming home. One firm even ran ads saying shipments from Europe were arriving daily. That gold had waited there for 40 years. The fourth method required nothing but silence. There were no house searches and no systematic sweeps of rural properties, farmhouses, or private homes. Every documented prosecution involved someone trying to sell, trade, or move large quantities of gold through the financial system and getting caught. Americans who simply kept their coins at home or buried them on their land were never found. Rural America was essentially beyond the reach of enforcement. There is no evidence of a single prosecution coming out of a farming community. The Americans who lost their gold were the ones who trusted the banking system to hold it. The Americans who kept their gold trusted nothing but the gold itself and told no one. The United States was not unique. Gold confiscation has a global history, and the pattern repeats. First comes economic crisis, then currency pressure, then forced surrender. Australia's Banking Act of 1959 authorized the government to require all gold to be delivered to the Reserve Bank within 30 days. The provision was suspended in 1976, but it technically remains on the books and could be revived. India's Gold Control Act of 1968 was probably the most ambitious confiscation attempt ever made in a democracy, and one of the clearest failures. Finance Minister Morarji Desai banned private ownership of gold bars and coins and limited families to 4 kilograms of jewelry. Gold smuggling exploded. Goldsmiths staged nationwide protests for 3 years. Some, ruined overnight by the destruction of their trade, killed themselves. Yet private gold holdings still rose during the control period, from about 4,000 tons in 1974 to an estimated 25,000 tons today. The law was repealed in 1990. The Soviet Union was the extreme case. And between 1928 and 1938, the NKVD arrested about 500,000 people for possessing gold. Trading gold was treated as a capital crime. In the 1961 Rokotov-Fibashenko case, currency speculators were executed after Khrushchev personally intervened to make their sentences harsher retroactively. Then there is Switzerland, which has never confiscated gold in its history. Constitutional change there requires a referendum, which makes confiscation politically close to unthinkable. Swiss refineries process about 70% of the world's gold bars. For Switzerland, confiscation would amount to economic self-destruction. Across all of these cases, the same principle appears again and again. Confiscation becomes attractive when a gold-linked monetary system is under pressure. The more tightly gold is tied to official money, the stronger the government's motive to seize it. That brings the story to the present. The United States legalized private gold ownership again on December 31st, 1974, when President Ford signed the legislation. The legal architecture Roosevelt used, especially Section 5B of the Trading with the Enemy Act, was fundamentally altered in 1977. Congress stripped the president of peacetime emergency powers over gold and limited them to declared war. The United States has not formally declared war since 1941. The later emergency statute, the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, is broad but still limited. Legal scholars note that it allows assets to be frozen, not confiscated. It requires a threat that essentially comes from outside the United States, which rules out a purely domestic financial crisis. It has never been used to confiscate gold from American citizens. On top of that, the Fifth Amendment's takings clause now creates a constitutional barrier that did not meaningfully exist in practice in 1933. If the government tried to seize gold today, it would have to pay fair market value. With gold trading above $2,000 an ounce and no fixed official price to manipulate, the government could not repeat Roosevelt's move of paying one price and then immediately revaluing the metal higher. The practical enforcement gap is wider now than it was in 1933. Back then, most gold sat in banks, institutions the government already controlled. Today, gold can be bought anonymously in coin shops, stored at home, kept in private vaults, or held abroad. There is no federal registry of gold owners. American gold eagles are explicitly exempt from the reporting rules that apply to most investment sales. But not all gold is equally protected. Gold ETFs, such as GLD or IAU, sit in the vaults of custodians, and a government order to those custodians could freeze or seize that gold immediately. Gold held inside an IRA through an approved custodian also moves through the tax system. It is tracked. It is reachable. Those are the modern equivalents of the 1933 bank deposit. Physical gold in private hands is, under the current legal framework, far harder for the government to reach. That is why the more realistic modern threats are not confiscation, but taxation and control. Congress could raise the collectibles tax rate. It could impose a windfall profits tax on gold gains. It could tighten reporting requirements or restrict gold exports through capital controls. But an open confiscation of privately held physical gold is viewed by legal scholars across the ideological spectrum as implausible to nearly impossible under the constitutional and statutory system that exists today. The forensic record leaves a clear conclusion. The gold confiscation of 1933 was not the total success the government presented it as. 3 out of 4 ounces were never surrendered. The people who lost their gold were the ones who kept it inside the system, in banks and financial institutions, in forms the government could see, reach, and control. The people who kept their gold understood the one thing the government needed them not to understand. Enforcement required visibility, and visibility was a choice. A great deal has changed since 1933. The law is different, the constitutional barriers are higher, the enforcement tools are weaker, there is no gold-backed currency to defend, and no monetary motive remotely comparable to the one Roosevelt faced. But one thing has not changed. The gold that survives government action, whether taxation, reporting rules, or the highly unlikely scenario of a future confiscation attempt, is the gold held privately, physically, and quietly. The gold the government can find is the gold the government can take. The real lesson of 1933 was written not by the order itself, but by the 75 to 80% of Americans who kept quiet and kept their gold in their own hands.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Stay informed, stay rational. See you in the next one.